So, yeah, very much, very pleased to be able to talk to you tonight on something that I'm feeling very excited by. I found, as Surya Daya suggested, a few of us from the Bristol Sangha went on a retreat at Adhisthana, with Adhisthana recently, looking at the teaching or the approach of these four myths. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight, why I think they're so important, why I think it could be a really helpful frame for our engagement with the Dharma. But I'm going to start this evening with a simile for the Dharma from the White Lotus Sutra. So this is from the White Lotus Sutra. It is like a great cloud rising above the world, covering all things everywhere. A gracious cloud full of moisture, lightning flames flash and dazzle, voice of thunder vibrates afar, bringing joy and ease to all. The sun's rays are veiled and the earth is cooled. The cloud lowers and spreads, as if it might be caught and gathered. It rains everywhere equally, descending on all sides, streaming and pouring unstinted, permeating the land, on mountains, by rivers, in valleys, in hidden recesses. There grow the plants, trees and herbs, trees both great and small, the shoots of ripening grain, grapevine and sugarcane. Fertilized are these by the rain and abundantly enriched. The dry ground is soaked. Herbs and trees flourish together from the one water issuing from that cloud. Plants, trees, thickets, forests, all growing according to their needs, receiving moisture. And all the various trees, lofty, medium, low, each according to its size, grows and develops, roots, stalks, branches, leaves, blossoms and fruits in their brilliant colours. Wherever the one rain reaches, all become fresh and glossy. According as their bodies, forms and natures are great or small, so the enriching rain, though it is one and the same, makes each one of them individually flourish. So this is the image of the effect of the rain on the different plants and herbs, and it suggests that although there is only one rain, how that rain is absorbed and expressed is going to be unique for every person, every plant. And when allowing this simile to rest in my mind, it takes me to one of the great mysteries of teaching in a Buddhist center. So what happens to all those people who come along, who seem so keen, so fired up by the Dharma, and then without any warning, they disappear? I do wonder if one of the biggest risks we have as individuals entering this community and engaging with the living Dharma is to imagine that there's only one proper way to be a Buddhist. And this can be compounded when we add in this natural tendency that we probably all have to compare or contrast our personal, contrast our own responses and approaches with those of us around us. And I think it's so important that we know that just because others flourish as a consequence of engaging with certain approaches, it doesn't mean that that approach is going to work for us. So I see it in myself and I see it in others, that we can easily make ourselves either wrong or make others wrong because of our differences, rather than celebrating and relishing this complexity and richness of our differences. So my concern is that a Sangha, which is bound by a limited perspective regarding how a Buddhist should be, how a Buddhist should live and act, a Sangha bound by any particular habitual ways of doing things, may be distorting the flourishing life activated by the Dharma reign. So a Sangha that's held too tightly by imagined or self-constructed and unspoken group norms will become an ever-reducing circle, practicing only replication rather than living out of the emergent dance between the call of the Dharma and our individual responsiveness, which is found through the breath and our heart response. So this might sound like I am advocating throwing out all form, but actually it's more an invitation to trust our own responsiveness, find the forms of practice that really bring us to life, and acknowledge and celebrate our diverse approaches rather than imagining we have to conform to some imagined Triratna monoculture. I think the more we can know this in our own experience and communicate it through our classes and through our friendships, we'll be holding open the door for diversity and honouring the vision of Sangharakshita, which saw one of the distinct emphases of our Sangha as being that of recognising that our communality grows out of honouring each person's unique, heartfelt relation to the Buddha Dharma, and not primarily by determining how that connection is expressed. So having said that, it does seem that there are common themes or similarities of expression that might be helpful for us to recognise and test out in our experience. So this brings me to the kind of core of what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So I'm going to be talking about 4 ways that the Dharma can be received and enacted. And these have been termed the 4 myths. So we're using this term myth because a myth is a story that's held in the imagination, that carries within it a meaningful image, a shape, a narrative. So a myth is something like a template. It's certainly a guide or a map that we can use to draw out meaning from our own experience and articulate that meaning to ourselves and to each other through the myth. So holding a myth in mind is a really powerful and helpful method to bring meaningful form to experience. So myths are really particularly helpful to discover or recognize what is really truly bringing us alive right now in relation to the Dharma reign. Of course, we have to recognize that in time, the myth or the shape of our story out of which we're living, that might change, which is why we need this, these 4 different myths rather than just one single approach. But I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to suggest that it might be helpful to check out that that you or I, we're not limiting ourselves or distorting our potential by gripping onto a particular myth because of some imagined external pressure or a desire to fit in. It might be even simpler than that. We might not even know that there are so many different ways to engage with the living Dharma, all equally valid, and yet they may not have been fully articulated to us, or simply we've never had the opportunity to test or engage with them in our own life. For me, I think we could really use these 4 myths in the same way that we've been invited to make use of the 5 spiritual faculties, this overarching pattern of engagement with the Dharma that we've been focusing on this year, during Sangha night this year. So we could see them as faculties, and we could see them as a mandala of potential. They're a means to articulate and evaluate our engagement and notice which myth is more to the fore and which has less resonance for us at any time. And hopefully we'll see that this will change. But maybe it's good to remember it's this capacity for recognition, but also for fluidity and an appropriate responsiveness that is so vital to keep our Dharma life alive in ourselves and in our relationship with the Sangha. So I hope I'm communicating that I'm really excited by these four myths and their relationship to each other. I think the articulation of these myths really gives us permission and encouragement to find our own unique way of engaging with the Dharma, whilst honouring and encouraging different approaches to practice. I feel they give us the means to articulate the vital dynamic of diversity held within a deeper unifying principle. So maybe I should personalize what I'm saying here. I feel for me, these four myths give me permission to live the Dharma life in a shape that fits my own sensibilities and responses. I feel these four myths are really helping me recognize and honor what brings me wholly alive in relation to the Dharma. And as importantly, this structure gives me the means to stay in healthy relation to others around me who seem to have such different perspectives, different ways of living their own Dharma life. So these four myths really give me a lot of hope and optimism about the future of the order and through that the movement, because on occasions we can seem somewhat polarized by our different approaches to the Dharma life. So this model of the four myths, it really allows and describes how we can find a deeper communality within our apparent differences. So going back to this image of the rain cloud, it evokes the sense that the Dharma was shared by the Buddha skillfully, appropriately, helpfully for each unique situation. So every individual he met as he travelled the paths of northern India, through villages, forests, into towns and markets and palaces, each person that he met was able to receive the Dharma. So although there is only one Dharma rain cloud, the Buddha always found the means to meet the specific situations skillfully. And it seems to me this limitless wisdom of the rain cloud is perhaps even more needed today than it's ever been. So there is always this unity of the rain cloud, but never one single way that we have to respond and grow through our relationship to it. We are trees and herbs, we are ripening grain, grapevines and sugarcane. And this for me is why the Sangha is so fascinating and rich. The Dharma invites us to find our own relationship to it and live our own expression of it in the conditions within which we are growing. And this was always the vision of Sangharakshita for our community. He described it as a free association of true individuals, profoundly united by knowing our commonality lay in our alignment to the three refuges and not in any particular expression or external form. So hopefully you'll remember that a few weeks ago we had 3 beautiful talks from Beata and Louis and Dan. And Beata talked about how she received the Dharma kinesthetically, releasing and transforming the blocked energy of fear. And she spoke of these emerging images and wild swimming, and how all this connected her to passion, which was being released by putting down the need to be a good person. And we heard from Louis, how he released his sadness and disappointment by becoming visible within the Sangha. Described how he'd worked with a particular strong view of determinism that had bound him. And he tenderly described discovering the Dharma wisdom within ethics. And from that, recognizing that acts of kindness are living expressions of wisdom. And finally, we heard from Dan and his revelation that acceptance is revolutionary. And he talked beautifully about the dangers of literalism in relation to family life and Dharma expression. And he shared with us his journey of engagement without expectation and putting down the tyranny of shouldism. So we can see clearly in these talks how the one Dharma Raincloud was transforming individual lives. And they reminded me again how from the time of the Buddha, this life-giving rain continues to fall upon the mountains, the hidden recesses, and the forest of humanity. The rain of the Dharma has been flowing from person to person, flowing into different cultures, different tribes and countries. And these streams of conversations and meaningful meetings have flowed through history, right to this day, right to the door of the Bristol Buddhist Centre, creating infinite examples of the many ways of maturing and flourishing through the receiving of the rain of the Dharma. So when we talk about the Dharma life, we often use the term path. And this suggests a beginning or a starting point, a setting out, a journey and a goal. And everyone in this Sangha has already been walking their own path before stepping into the Buddhist Centre. We will have come far and we'll be carrying with us our history, our habits, our views and our vision. And we'll be living out of the many strategies that have helped keep us safe and given us meaning. And we will be bringing into this community our pain and our passion, hidden or revealed. We'll be arriving here with our views, our values and our longings. And we don't have to be around each other for very long before we recognize how each and every one of us have a unique path, which has created such a rich, eclectic and wondrous bunch of individuals that we collectively are. And I think this is something to be really celebrated. The jewel of liberation only shines and reveals its fullness because of its many facets. The life of the jewel is created by the light of the Dharma refracting off each facet, revealing the true nature and the vibrancy of the whole. Each facet is a unique expression of the light. And to remain a vibrant Sangha that is welcoming and expressive of the living Dharma, it needs different modes, different strategies to effectively meet every unique being who seeks the Dharma through the Bristol Buddhist Centre. And for me, this is why the 4 myths are so helpful. They clearly articulate unity through diversity, and through that honours and values each one of us. So I'm going to share some images with you now and talk you through them in a way as the means to articulate these four myths to you. So I hope you can see that. So what we have here is that, well, just to remind us that Buddhism isn't just about the Buddha. It's actually about the means to live fruitfully in the gap between what we describe as us and what we describe as the Buddha. And this is really where the whole of the spiritual life takes place, in this gap between ourself, me, I, you, and what we describe as the Buddha. And we can describe it in different ways. The means to end of suffering, the means for liberation, the presence of the wish-fulfilling or the creation of the wish-fulfilling jewel, finding the well in a desert, or simply creating freedom. So this is the basis for the four myths, working in the gap. And the question is, how do we work in that gap? So what we have is this simple diagram, just to begin to open out what I mean, or what we mean when we talk about the four myths. So you can see that we have on the left-hand side, we basically have two modes of acting, approaching our practice. We can have an active engagement, or what we might describe as a more receptive means or approach to practice. And also, just to make bring the four together, we also have different ideas, understanding of where we locate the goal. So we might see the goal as being outside and beyond us, or we might see the goal as being within us, right here. And that creates this set of four models, which have these different terms just to indicate the types of the myths that we can engage with. So the first myth is the myth of development. That is, that by applying ourselves to the practices of the Dharma, that eventually I will become the Buddha. So through the teachings, through engaging with the practices, I develop from where I am now to Buddhahood. The second one, the second myth, very simply, is the myth of surrender. So in this one, the Buddha becomes me. I invite the influence of the Buddhas into my life. So there's a sense of surrender, of service, to invite the influences of the Buddha into our life. So this is very much the receptive path. But it's still, we're seeing the Buddha as being something beyond us, outside of ourselves, which we are trying to open to and allow to enter our life. But there's also two other modes which are dependent on viewing the sense of the Buddha being something which is inherent within us. So we have what's called the myth of discovery. This is, I uncover my inherent Buddha nature by working to dissolve these obscuring veils of delusion, the views and habits that hold me out of my natural Buddha nature. So this is a myth of discovery. And the final myth is that of emergence. So the myth of emergence is more a receptive engagement with life. So I notice the potential of Buddha nature is always here, at least in potential, in every moment. So this is the four myths very briefly described, and I'll just say a few things about these myths. So one thing to say in regard to these myths is that, is that it's important that we recognize or understand that at different points, different phases of our spiritual life, we'll tend to move around and through these different myths. So we are trying in some way to close this gap to arrive at what we describe as closing the gap between ourselves and the Buddha. And the whole path of the Dharma is really this journey to close that gap. And in closing and in going on that journey, we will inevitably, inevitably we'll move between or through these different phases. So this is the beautiful floor maze in Chartres Cathedral in northern France. And what it illustrates is that to get to that center, to that heart, we move around the whole maze. And what's interesting is that you can see that one could imagine that it's possible to get locked or bound in a particular myth. If we do that, if we kind of bind ourselves into too tightly into a particular myth, what will happen is actually we don't explore the whole journey. We can't complete the whole journey. We're kind of held in a sort of limbo space where, although it's all very meaningful in a way, our view is unhelpfully limited by the myth that we have become locked into. So it's important to recognize that these myths are not fixed and our relationship to them. We need to be alert and alive that we will move through them through time. The other way of looking at these four myths is to recognize that they are actually part of a mandala. So again, just recognizing that where we're trying to get to is the very heart of the mandala, and every aspect of the mandala is always in relation to the center, always in relation to the whole. So even if we find ourselves really focused and moving within the myth of development, we can see that it's intimately connected with the whole. These four myths are all working in the same, with the same intention, with the same aim of moving to the heart of the mandala. Now, when these four myths were introduced by the senior order member called Subhuti, he very helpfully talked about these myths having what we describe as a front and a back, an opening perspective, something that really opens us into the fullness of the myth, the richness of the myth, and the back face, which is more a literalism or a kind of closing down around a particular myth, which is very unhelpful in that we kind of bind around it and become closed to the potential of the myth to unfold us helpfully. So just very quickly going to go through these different ways that we either open the myth or close it down. simply by how we engage with it. And perhaps it's important to recognize that, unfortunately, these two aspects probably are very closely bound with each other. Subhuti describes it as like being two sides of a coin that can easily flip over and be an unhelpful engagement with the myth. So let's go through them quickly. So let's have a quick look at development. So the front face of this myth of development is that really gives us the means to creatively engage with change. It says change is happening all the time. We can make use of this capacity and reality of change, use it to adapt, create our life, to move towards freedom, to move towards liberation. And we often, if we are engaged with this developmental model, we look to the historical Buddha as an exemplar, as a kind of prime template really for this beautiful myth. And the historical Buddha, we could say, one of the main images of the path of development is that of renunciation. It's a path of renunciation, a giving up, a letting go, a surrendering into ever more freer, liberated states. But as I said, each of these myths have a shadow side or a back, a literal closed side. So what happens, or what is the risk of the developmental model, is that we deny what's actually in our experience. Rather than having the capacity to be with, we're always trying to get somewhere else. And this is called, the term for this, which is coined by John Wellwood, is called spiritual bypassing. So because we are so keen on the myth of development, we actually are trying to step through our experience to get somewhere else. This is spiritual bypassing. And there's also another thing related to this, which is spiritual materialism. Now, this term was coined by Chogyam Trungpa. And what he saw, recognized that some people on the spiritual path, what they're really looking for is peak experiences. So the whole path of the Dharma becomes a quest for higher states of consciousness, when actually what we're really looking for is the path of liberation, to free ourselves from being bound or identified with any particular state of being, state of mind. So this is the path of development, these two faces. So let's move on to the path of surrender. So the path of surrender can be a really beautiful path. I describe it as the path of mystery, engaging with mystery. So really leaning into inspiration and guidance and support from the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. These beautiful images or presences that we can feel in our practice, that we can lean into and surrender to. And we have this term going for refuge, this seeking refuge in the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. The shadow side, the back side of this, this way of practice is that we can create an unhelpful dualism, even a theism. We can see the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas almost as gods that we have to placate and come into some passive relationship to. And it can also give us a sense of what is termed by Sangha alienated awareness. Because we're so intent on surrendering to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas that we lose our sense of our own embodiment. the sense of being in this world, here and now. We're so taken over by surrendering to these other worldly forces or presences, we almost become disembodied in our practice. It's almost as if the path to surrender runs this risk of really losing touch with the simple act of being here, human and alive. So let's have a look at the next model, which is that of the path of discovery. So the path of discovery can be really a very optimistic and integrating path for many of us. What it offers is that it shows the importance of to progress towards liberation, we have to really know ourselves really well. Psychologically, our own psychology, our habits, our views, all have to be taken into consideration and really known fully so that we can release from them. And this is really, we could describe this as the path of uncovering. So we discover that which keeps us out of our natural, our true nature. These habits of being that we've created through whatever reason, through our history, through our lives, they limit our capacity to live fully our potential, our own Buddha nature. But like the other myths, the path of discovery has its shadow side. And this is that we become self-identified with this idea of Buddha nature, that somehow it's me that becomes a Buddha. And this delusion, this reification, if you like, of ourselves and the Buddha, molded, formed into this sense of something permanent and ongoing, risks what we describe as an eternalistic perspective. So in a way, it doesn't matter that we live and die so many times, because the Buddha is always there within us. So we don't have to work to uncover the Buddha. We just simply trust that the Buddha nature is always there. And at some point in the future, maybe we'll start to bring that into reality. So this eternalistic perspective can really limit or take the energy out of our practice. The final one is this sensitivity to the actual, emergence, which is this sensitivity to the actual. So in the emergence model, we really build this capacity to know what's happening as and when it's happening. So this particular myth really relies on awareness itself and leads to what I describe as the path of interconnectedness. We recognize that all life is trying to give expression to the Dharma. All life has this potential to receive the reign of the Dharma and transform towards liberation. Every moment, every meeting, every experience, inner or outer, always has this potential for liberation. So this is the path of emergence. And the shadow side of this is that there's a risk of fatalism. Well, things will just carry on emerging as they will, without any control, without any continuity of purpose. We can just almost give in to life as it comes and goes around us. And particularly, we may run the risk of not seeing that the spiritual life requires an ethical dimension. If we're simply relying on the emergent myth, the shadow side of that is, well, anything goes. But of course, actions have consequences. If we look at the development myth, we recognize this, which is maybe a small example of why it's so important that these four myths are interwoven and that we have an awareness of each one of them. So this is my message regarding these four myths, that they are always in relationship to each other, to the whole. And it's really key that we remember this necessity. Without that, we can run the risk of these shadow sides, these shadow faces, coming too much to the fore in our practice. And I think it might be helpful to recognize that each of these myths, actually we can use them as a series of, that if we find ourselves completely lost in one particular myth, it might be helpful to recognize that just as when we use the spiritual faculties, when we find ourselves very strongly in one pole, one corner of the mandala, one corner of the maze, we may find it useful to open and just bring into attention that these other modes may be helpful to us. So this is the double Bhadra, which is a very beautiful symbol, and we can imagine actually that the gap, the freedom, actually lies here at the heart of these different modes, these different myths, and that each of these blossoming lotuses that create the four myths, actually each one of them can lead us back through the core, the heart of the myth, back to the center and through out to the other myth, which may help keep everything in balance, in play, so that our spiritual life is vibrant and alive. And finally, just to say, in relation to this image, I think it's a beautiful image for Sangha. But what we can see here is that the whole relies on these four myths being present, being vibrantly alive for us, available to us. And it's through this capacity to hold this range of diversities and difference that this beautiful form, this beautiful image of the enlightened mind can really be brought into our Sangha, brought into life. Each of us has the capacity to draw on these myths in our own way and contribute to the whole. For me, this is why I find it such an optimistic message. These four myths allow us, encourage us to find our own means, our own expression of the rain, the living rain that comes through each one of us as we engage with each other and create the Dharma for the benefit of the world.